Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
I was standing in the sweater aisle holding two red cardigans because my mother still believes matching outfits make us a family in photographs even when the smiles go brittle by dessert. And I was close enough to hear Aunt Linda's stage whisper float over the racks like a cheap carol, bright and soured at the edges. "He's nothing but our ATM," and I didn't turn or flinch or gift her the scene she was fishing for. I just folded the softer cardigan over my arm, paid for my mother's at the register with a voice as even as the barcode beeps, and walked out into the chill carrying a plan that already knew the shape of Christmas night. I did not become the person who pays for Christmas dinner because I love applause or the feeling of playing hostess from a seat in the corner. I became that person the year my father had surgery and the calendar held more pills than holidays, and my mother, who is tender and stubborn in the same breath, kept saying we would figure it out while I stared at a checking account that looked like a scraped plate, and when a promotion arrived like a life raft tied with a corporate ribbon, I told the restaurant to put the entire evening on my card, which felt like tossing a blanket over a drafty window, and everyone clapped as if I had invented generosity rather than simply purchasing quiet for a night. The second year happened because convenience is a seductive liar, and the third because Uncle Pete performed that sheepish pocket pat and declared himself walletless while ordering something aged and brown. And by the fifth, the tradition had a name no one said aloud because it did not need one. The way gravity never needs a label to do its job. What began as a kindness calcified into expectation. And expectation nested into entitlement so neatly that even I forgot where it started, until that sweater aisle reminded me with one cocky sentence that dripped out of Linda's mouth like cough syrup gone bad. I carried my mother's cardigan home, draped it over the chair she uses to drink her tea and write lists with her neat hummingbird handwriting, and then I opened my laptop and treated my own history like a ledger I had been too polite to read. Pulling 5 winters of statements and isolating the lines that spelled our ritual in digits, steaks and samplers and celebratory bourbons marching down the page like ornaments too shiny to admit their weight, and when I scrolled the family group chat, I found Linda's breezy nudges about time and place punctuated with an emoji applause line and that careful phrase, "Jenna always insists," which felt like watching someone rewrite a memory while I was still in the room. And I set my jaw and made a new document simply titled Plan because revenge is a childish word for what I wanted, which was not blood or spectacle but balance. The first item on the plan was small and almost tender, canceling the annual parade of box trinkets that get regifted down to neighbors we pretend to like, and replacing them with simple cards printed with a donation receipt to the food pantry near my mother's block, the one that smells like cinnamon and coffee and good intentions that do not advertise themselves. Each card addressed in my hand and stamped with my father's name, because I wanted at least one thing this season to matter. Without argument, the second item was a phone call to Ruth, the restaurant manager who keeps December from setting the building on fire, where I politely requested a private room with strict separate checks, no merging at the table, no coy, put it all together, and she exhaled the kind of laugh that sounds like a nurse's thank you after a rude shift and said she could and would. When the laundry thumped and the apartment settled into that late-night hum that makes your thoughts carry their own flashlight, I went spelunking through older emails and found, half buried in a thread about holiday seating and vegetarian options, a line that sat there like a thumbprint on a clean window, Linda writing to my mother years ago, let her feel needed, and it was not the most vicious sentence I have ever read, yet it wore a smugness that made my throat taste metallic, because I suddenly saw the staging. The way she had arranged me like a useful prop beside her speeches about togetherness, and I closed the laptop for a breath, opened it again, and pulled a dusty file box from my closet that holds the kind of papers you keep for a future argument with yourself. Inside the folder marked college sat my father's neat, all-caps note congratulating me on the scholarship that covered almost enough, promising we would figure out the rest without saying how, and tucked behind it a temporary family loan agreement I had not remembered in full until that moment, an amount that matched the leftover tuition written in careful ink, a signature from my parents, and a witness line initialed by Linda, who apparently had a business idea that year as festive as candy. canes and exactly as sturdy, and I felt the heat rise up my neck that is not rage so much as an allergic reaction to the way debt tries to disguise itself as love, and I understood in a single sweep why I had been the bridge everyone praised, because nobody wants to admit they're still standing in water. So I set the final item on my plan with the same steadiness I bring to budgets and bandages, a promise to myself that I would be generous precisely and not expansively, that I would cover my mother's dessert and her tea and nothing else, that I would show up on Christmas night with a smile that did not leak, and that I would let the checks land like snowfall on every plate where a knife had gleamed, because traditions do not own me and being kind does not mean being quiet, and as I slid the donation cards into their envelopes and stacked them like clean plates, my phone buzzed with Ruth's midnight email asking for a deposit card for the private room because Cousin Megan's had declined after Aunt Linda suggested she handle it, and the subject line said, "Urgent confirmation please," and I stared at the blinking cursor over my own card number, then closed the message without sending a thing, the room still around me except for the string of Christmas lights that hummed like a question I would answer in front of everyone. By the time the reservation confirmation hit my inbox with the subject line that always makes December feel like a chore dressed up as tradition, I had already made the call to Ruth and asked her, in the calm tone that makes people listen even when they dislike what they are hearing, to move us into the small side room with the frosted glass and to mark our party for strict separate checks without exceptions or last-minute improvisations. Because I had learned that chaos hides most comfortably inside phrases like, "Oh, just throw it on mine," and "we'll figure it out later," which is how a single night stretches into a pattern, and how a pattern becomes a cage you decorate with garlands and pretend is a wreath. Ruth, who has the voice of someone who has rescued more holidays than a dozen angels in snow globes, reminded me that the private room required a deposit, and instead of letting the quiet guilt muscle its way back into my mouth with an easy use my card, I said, in a voice that sounded even to me like a boundary finally remembering its shape, that my cousin Megan would be providing the deposit since she was, in Aunt Linda's own cheerful phrasing on the family text, so tech-savvy and on top of logistics this year, and while that was not a direct commitment, it was a public nudge preserved in pixels, and if Linda wanted to choreograph the evening like a pageant then she could, at minimum, fund the rehearsal hall. The drive to my mother's place that afternoon ran along streets that still wore last week's snow like an old sweater, and as I carried in the groceries and checked the stubborn thermostat that rattles when it is tired, I thought about how easily generosity turns into an operating system for a family, with one person doing the updates and everyone else enjoying the smooth apps. And I realized I had been writing patches for years without ever asking who had introduced the bugs, which is why I went to the hall closet and pulled down the plastic storage bin marked "papers we might need," a label my father wrote in his engineer's printing that always made me feel steady even when the numbers did not. And I laid the folders out on the dining table where the afternoon light tells the truth without cruelty. Inside the envelope labeled college, where I expected to find only the old scholarship letter and the program from my graduation with my father's proud check marks along the margins, sat the temporary family loan agreement, whose language had sounded practical when I was young enough to believe in bridges that build themselves, the amount precisely matching the gap tuition left each semester, the signatures a tidy trio that tried to look like consensus, and the witness line signed by Linda, with a looping flourish that suddenly felt less like support and more like a foot in the door, and as the heat of recognition moved up my throat I could hear my father's patient voice tell me that bridges are dependable only when weight limits are respected, while my mother, quietly bustling in the kitchen with the tea towels, called out whether I preferred lemon or honey as if the world were not dividing itself into before and after right there on the table. I asked, as gently as I could without losing the point to the soft fog of nostalgia, whether that loan had ever been repaid, and my mother, who has always hated conflict the way other people hate the smell of bleach, said that Linda had promised, and then time got away from everyone, and then there were other priorities like Pete's job shifting and Megan's tuition hiccup and the kind of business idea that looks glossy in November and limp by February. And I realized that the tradition of me paying for Christmas dinner was less a halo for my generosity than a gauze bandage wrapped around a wound nobody wanted to examine, because if I continued to keep the evening painless, the family could claim we were whole, whereas if I stopped, the scar tissue would show up under the lights and make the photos crackle. When I got back to the apartment, where lists thrive and confessions become bullet points before they sharpen into decisions, I found an email from Ruth with the subject line, "Deposit Update," and the simple body text that Megan's card had been declined and that Linda had called to suggest using the card we usually use, which made me laugh in that silent, feral way people laugh when confirmation arrives with the grace of a hammer. Because apparently even a declined card is not enough to interrupt the script if everyone has agreed to pretend that my wallet is a community resource and my name is optional. I wrote back that the deposit should be charged to the corporate house account attached to Aunt Linda's client dinners, yes, the one under her company name with the very festive description field, and I signed the message with the kind of professional courtesy that says I have receipts and I am not afraid to organize them. That evening, as the washing machine clanked like a worn-out percussion section and the streetlights flicked on with their usual indifferent magic, I laid out the cream envelopes with the pantry donation slips, penciled each person's name in my even hand, and rehearsed the toast I would give that would sound like warmth while quietly shifting the furniture in the room, promising myself that I would cover my mother's dessert and her tea and not one bite more, because love is not a bottomless account and tenderness can coexist with steel if you let it, and while my phone hummed with Linda's messages, brisk, performative, and entirely convinced of their own necessity, I placed the envelopes in my bag, turned off every light except the small string over the bookshelf, and sat in that soft glow long enough to feel the first clean breath of a new arrangement that would look, to anyone invested in the old one, like betrayal, which is the price you pay when you move a story from fantasy into fact, and accept that some people will call that cruelty while others will call it finally telling the truth. Christmas night arrived with the kind of cold that turns breath into a visible argument, and as I parked half a block away to buy myself the length of a quiet walk, I rehearsed the tone I would use that lived somewhere between gracious and surgical, because the plan would only work if I sounded like I believed in the very warmth I was rearranging, and when I stepped into the lobby and saw the twinkle lights trying too hard to make everyone behave, I told Ruth we were here for the private room, the one she had saved for us with a level of professional mercy that felt almost biblical. And she smiled the weary smile of someone who has watched families attempt miracles with dessert menus and said we were all set once the outstanding room deposit was confirmed, which I assured her was already handled through Aunt Linda's corporate house account. A phrase I delivered softly enough to pass like background music, yet with enough shape to make clear I knew exactly where the money would land. The room itself had frosted glass pane like a polite secret, a small tree dressed in paper snowflakes that looked hand-cut by someone trying to remember joy, and a long table draped in linen so stiff it could keep its own posture. And I pulled out the chair beside my mother's because she is the only person I will always sit next to even when I need space to stage an intervention, and she looked at me in the careful way mothers look when they cannot tell whether their daughter is about to save the evening or set it on fire, which, for honesty's sake, I was prepared to do if that was the only way to stop the tradition from eating another year. Linda entered late enough to collect attention like a coat check ticket, sweeping in on a cloud of perfume and noise with Uncle Pete lugging shopping bags that suggested effort and generosity while costing less than either. And Cousin Megan followed in a blazer that wanted to be taken seriously, offering me a smile that flickered like a weak signal, and, before anyone could annex the narrative with the usual exchange of "so good to see you" and "what a year," I stood, raised a water glass. Because alcohol would muddy the edges I needed sharp, and gave the kind of toast that performs as gratitude while slipping a boundary through customs, saying that I loved how our little rituals kept us stitched together and that tonight, in honor of my father who prized receipts and clarity and never allowed a debt to get comfortable, we were doing something simple and fair where everyone would treat themselves and no one would feel obligated to treat the entire table, a declaration wrapped in soft wrapping paper that nevertheless made Linda's smile thin into something that showed the shape of her teeth. I sat and slid the cream envelopes to each place setting with an even hand that hid the tremor living under my wrist, and when Uncle Pete asked, with a performative chuckle that aimed for breezy and landed near brittle, Whether these were our stocking stuffers for grown-ups, I told him they were small notes I wanted to share before the evening got loud, and my mother tried to catch my eye as if to say we could still abort the mission and pretend this never felt wrong. But I shook my head almost invisibly and watched as everyone opened their envelopes and saw the neat, unembellished printouts listing the items I had personally covered over the last few Christmas dinners with no totals and no underlines. Just a quiet column of steaks and bourbon and samplers and second desserts to take home for later, each page ending with a single sentence in my father's spirit that read, "In memory of a rough year made less rough by shared table and clear promises." And the silence that followed felt less like shock and more like air finally returning to a room where it had been politely rationed. Linda did not open hers at first, choosing instead to tilt her head and say with theatrical gentleness that this kind of accounting must be exhausting for me, and perhaps I would feel lighter if I simply allowed tradition to be tradition. And I replied that tradition without consent is just inertia in a holiday sweater, and that I was done confusing endurance with love. And when she finally slit the envelope and read, her eyes moved in quick little darts, as if the sentences might rearrange themselves into a version that made her look benevolent, and she declared that the whole exercise felt tacky, which is the word people reach for when the truth refuses to dim its light to match their narrative. Ruth approached then with the polite firmness of an air traffic controller guiding a plane full of difficult relatives, noting that the system still needed a signature accepting the deposit charge to the corporate account on file to finalize the room. And I watched Linda's hand hover over the pen like she suspected it might stain, while Megan shifted in her chair as the memory of her declined card painted her cheeks, and Uncle Pete pretended to study the specials as if reading were a currency. And my mother reached under the table and squeezed my knee twice in her old signal that means keep your balance even if the bridge shakes, so I nodded at Ruth and said, "Of course, we appreciate the accommodation." And I slid the clipboard toward Linda with a small smile that would look to any bystander like affection, but carried the weight of a corrected ledger. The room's laughter, when it returned, had a nervous timbre that turned every joke into an audition, and as the appetizers landed and the menus folded like surrendered flags, I realized the real experiment had already begun. Because separate checks are not just a payment method, they're a mirror that shows people how hungry they are when no one else is footing the appetite, and I felt, in the buzz of conversation that kept searching for safe topics and failing, the first crisp crack in a habit that had long pretended to be love, which is why, when Linda finally lifted her eyes and announced to the room that I had promised to host, and that our little detour into itemized nostalgia would end with me doing the right thing, I let the silence stretch to an inch past comfortable, and then said, evenly and without charity, that the right thing this year was honesty dressed in linen. Ruth returned with a subtle nod that told me the deposit had cleared against the house account exactly as planned, which dropped the temperature of Linda's smile by another few degrees, and I took a sip of tea so I would not overplay my hand. Because I needed the moment to land without theatrics, only certainty, and while the entrees paraded in and my mother's small plate of carrot cake and a teapot were quietly confirmed for later as the only items I would cover, I felt the table brace for the inevitable arrival of the leather folders like a ship feeling the swell before the wave, and when I caught the manager's eye she gave the tiniest lift of her chin. The kind of signal seasoned professionals exchange when the performances are over and the numbers are about to start, which is exactly when Linda, whose survival instinct is to turn accusation into ambience, leaned forward and said we would settle everything the way we always have because that is what family does, and I smiled in a way that could be mistaken for agreement from a distance, while inside I was standing on the clean edge of a decision I refused to soften even if the room begged me to, and in that held breath before the checks touched down, I thought of my father's envelope, the pantry's cinnamon air, and the list in my head titled Things That Are Mine, as the door opened and Ruth stepped in with the stack that would test everyone's appetite for truth. When the leather folders finally arrived, stacked with the tidy menace of documents that do not care about anyone's feelings, the room performed a kind of collective inhalation that made the candle flames lean And I knew that this was the hinge moment where stories either harden into folklore or break open into facts. So I kept my hands folded on the table and let Ruth set a folder in front of each plate with that immaculate neutrality she wears like armor, while Aunt Linda adopted the bright, social tone she uses when she intends to steer the room by sheer volume and declared that since I had always hosted, and since it was the season of generosity, we should not burden the staff with unnecessary arithmetic. A suggestion that would have sailed unchallenged in every previous year except that this time, with the envelopes opened and the deposit already changed to her own corporate house account, the suggestion hung there like a chandelier missing one screw. And nobody rushed to stand under it. Uncle Pete, who has a natural gift for playing the ordinary man caught in extraordinary bureaucracy when the only bureaucracy present is the price of his own bourbon, flipped his folder open and then shut again as if the numbers might behave better if starved of oxygen. And he offered a semi-plausible story about having cash in the car and a bank transfer delay and a promise to settle at the end of the night if we could all just do what we always do, which in his translation meant what I always do, and I nodded with the kind of equanimity I learned in hospital waiting rooms, that quiet composure which can be mistaken for kindness by people who have never met boundaries in the wild, and I said that we were, in fact, doing exactly what we always claim to value, which is fairness that doesn't buckle under sentiment. Megan, whose blazer had been losing confidence by the course, asked in a voice so careful it could have passed for courtesy whether the restaurant could just put her portion on my card and she would Venmo me later. A ritual she delivered as a generous compromise even though we both knew it was a down payment on forgetting, and I answered with a gentle no that carried the history of 1,000 tiny yes, adding that I would happily cover the gratuity on her check because there are mercies I will still extend without allowing them to snag the whole garment, and I watched her shoulders drop a centimeter as she realized the ground rules were not going to liquefy just because her eyes did. Linda let the stiffness crawl up her throat until it made her smile look like a legal document, and then, still not opening her folder, she announced to the room that my behavior was a spectacular display of smallness masquerading as principle, that I was weaponizing math in a season that asked us to lay down our swords, and that my father, invoked now as a posthumous referee, would have been ashamed to see me itemize love. I might have let that land unanswered if it weren't for the fact that I could feel my mother's hand trembling against my knee under the table, her old signal that says keep your balance even if the bridge sways, so I took out my phone, pressed the speaker icon without flourish, and played the voicemail I had recorded in the mall when Linda forgot walls have ears, her bright, breathy laugh followed by the sentence that turned my charity into a caricature, he's nothing but our ATM. And I let the final consonant sit in the room like a dropped fork while the silence decided which side it was on. That is not the context, Linda said, because there is always a context somewhere that promises to launder the insult clean if you give it enough cycles. And she tried to pivot into a monologue about how I love to do things big, and how paying made me feel essential, and how she was, in a warped kindness, feeding a need so I could feel celebrated. But the language tasted like stale sugar, and I had finally stopped craving cake made of flattery, so I told her, evenly and without the heat she wanted to fight, that generosity offered freely is a gift and generosity assumed is a theft, and that we had been participating in the latter with seasonal decor, and, while my voice did not rise, my certainty did. And the table felt it the way a dock feels the tide. Ruth returned then, not to referee, but to present the policy card that explained the separate checks the way a museum placard explains a piece of art that people argue about without reading, and she said it in a small stand like a polite monument to logistics, adding in a tone that was neither pointed nor soft that the deposit had been successfully processed through the house account on file and that signatures were already complete, which earned her a flash of gratitude from me that I translated into a tip I would calculate later with the same precision I was granting the truth. Linda finally opened her folder and gazed at the numbers like they were personally disrespectful. And then she summoned that brittle graciousness she uses when she believes she is about to win a longer game, saying she would of course pay tonight because she did not wish to cause a scene, and perhaps next year we could reassess hosting arrangements in a more adult manner. A sentence that arrived lacquered in civility, but smelled like a threat left out in the sun. I leaned toward my mother and asked whether she was ready for her dessert and tea, and when Ruth placed the small carrot cake and the steaming pot with a quiet on Jenna, something in the room softened and then snapped back, because the gesture revealed the scale I had chosen. A love measured rather than poured without bottom, and I realized that even kindness needs an edge or it dissolves into something sticky and impossible to clean, which is why, when Uncle Pete started in on a heavy sigh about holiday hardship and changing times and the indignity of nickel and diming family, I reminded him, gently but without retreat, that nothing about his ribeye and top-shelf drink had been nickel or dime, and that dignity, if he wanted to measure it, had never been cheaper than honesty. The leather folders became wallets and phones and pens, and the room turned into that low, rustling economy of calculation where people relearn their appetites line by line. And as signatures bloomed and cards were tapped and the first copies of Itemized Truth slid back into hands that had not held them for years, Linda tried one more maneuver, lifting her chin and asking Ruth whether the restaurant could, as a courtesy, combine the checks after all, since it appeared the original plan had created distress, at which point Ruth, professional to the marrow and clearly immune to guilt masquerading as charm, replied that the instructions on the reservation were explicit and would be honored for everyone's clarity. A sentence that struck me as the closest thing to Christmas music I had heard all evening. I stood then, not because drama required height, but because my knees asked for air, and I looked around at the people who love me in ways that are both true and complicated, and I felt that old reflex to rescue rise like a blush, and held it down with both hands, telling myself that I was not abandoning the family by refusing to fund their comfort. I was refusing to abandon myself to their story, and when I lifted my glass it was only water, but it felt like something stronger, and I said, in a tone that did not shake, that tonight we were all going to do the bravest possible thing in a room full of history, which was to pay for what we had chosen and let the evening end without the usual lie. And as the last card processed and the printer chirped its blunt little song, I watched the realization travel across faces that had never expected to meet the bill so directly, and I knew the last step was mine and mine alone. So I drew a breath that made the frost on the window look thinner, and prepared to say the words that would not only finish the night, but also begin the part of my life where I did not apologize for wanting balance, even if the cost was silence. The silence that settled over the room after I stood with my glass of water was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a curtain falling in the middle of a play. When everyone in the audience realizes the story has shifted and the actors are exposed without their costumes, and I let that silence live for several long breaths before I spoke the words that had been building in me since the mall. Guess you'll have to pay for yourselves. Words that did not come with a shout or a flourish, but with the kind of steady weight that makes denial impossible, and the reaction was immediate, a ripple of discomfort traveling around the table as though I had tipped the whole thing on its axis. Uncle Pete recovered first, not with his wallet, but with that slow, weary sigh he uses when he wants to set the stage for sympathy, and he leaned back in his chair and launched into a speech about how times were difficult, how costs had gone up everywhere, how Christmas dinner was supposed to be about family not numbers, and how my father, if he were here, would want everyone together without this kind of spectacle, a monologue designed less to convince me than to make everyone else look at me like the villain who had punctured the evening, but I had carried too many receipts and too much quiet resentment to be swayed by an appeal draped in nostalgia, and I told him that my father valued honesty above everything, that he had hated owing even a neighbor for a borrowed tool, and that tonight was less about money than about refusing to be erased into a credit card with no face. Megan, who had been trying to disappear behind her blazer all night, let her composure crack then, her eyes filling and her voice thin as paper as she confessed that she had not brought enough with her because she had assumed things would be the same as every year. And she looked at me with a mixture of embarrassment and expectation, a silent plea for rescue, and while my first instinct was to reach across and cover her entirely as I had always done, I pushed that reflex down because generosity is no gift if it becomes a leash, and instead I told her that I would happily cover the gratuity on her bill so that she would not leave the table ashamed, but that the rest was hers. And she nodded with a kind of reluctant gratitude that looked more like learning than relief, which is perhaps the most useful gift I could have handed her. My mother broke her silence then, not with an argument but with a small, deliberate motion, sliding her own folder toward herself and taking out her card, her voice quiet but steady as she told Ruth that she could pay for her own meal. And in that moment I felt a lump in my throat because my mother, who has lived her life smoothing edges and absorbing costs to keep everyone else afloat, was telling me in the simplest gesture possible that she understood and that she was willing to stand with me, even if the others would not, and I loved her so fiercely in that instant that I had to look away so as not to lose my balance in front of the very people who thrived on my composure. Aunt Linda, who had sat with her folder unopened as if numbers ceased to exist when you refused to read them, finally snapped the clasp and stared at the bill as though it were a personal insult rather than an itemized record of her choices, and she announced, with venom laced into the false calm of her voice, that this entire performance was designed to humiliate her, that I had staged it to embarrass her in front of her own family, and that my donation cards, which she had earlier dismissed as tacky, were nothing but a sanctimonious stunt to remind her of her failures. But I met her tirade with the same tone I had carried all night, even unwavering, telling her that if I had wanted to humiliate her I would have sent the list of her so-called client Christmas dinners charged to her company account to the firm's financial officer, and the way her mouth snapped shut for just a second told me she knew I was not bluffing, though I did not need to make the threat louder because ambiguity has its own power when someone is already terrified of what you might do. When the final bills were signed and the last card processed, when the printer's small mechanical chirp announced that each of them had carried their share at last, I placed a final envelope in the center of the table. Not with drama, but with the kind of calm that makes people lean in despite themselves, and I told them that earlier that morning I had donated the average of the last 3 Christmas dinners I had covered to the local food pantry in memory of my father, that the donation had been made in each of their names, and that somewhere that evening families who did not have the luxury of debating entrees were sitting down to meals because of it. And while Uncle Pete muttered that I had no right to make that choice on their behalf, and Linda accused me again of theatrics, I watched my mother smile faintly through her tears and knew I had made the only decision that mattered. We left in a drift of awkward coats and half-hearted goodbyes, and in the parking lot, where the frost was sharp enough to sting, my phone vibrated with a voicemail from a law office asking for clarification about a family loan and potential tax implications. And though I had not tipped anyone off, the call sat there like a seed of consequence planted in soil none of us could ignore, and as I drove my mother home, she asked quietly whether we were still a family, a question that pierced me more deeply than any of Linda's accusations, and I told her that she and I always would be, though I could not make promises for the rest, because bridges can be repaired or replaced, but you have to decide which before you start. And in that moment the car felt both heavier with truth and lighter with relief. That night, long after I had put my mother safely to bed and sat alone at my own kitchen table, I opened my father's old envelope and slipped the pantry donation letter beside his note, then wrote the word bridge in my neatest hand across the folder. Because whether we were building anew or salvaging what was left, the truth was now out in the open, and while my phone buzzed with Linda's final message, "We need to talk tomorrow. Bring records," I placed it face down and let it hum unanswered, because for the first time in years the bill had been paid, not by me but by all of us, and the silence in my apartment was not heavy but clean, a silence that made space for possibility. Even if that possibility was not reconciliation but freedom.